In the quiet realm between dream and waking, there stood a Viking, a lone figure with braided beard and the weight of northern storms resting on his shoulders, his axe heavy in his calloused hands, his spirit burning with defiance against the fate written for him. Before him stretched a plain unlike any he had known, vast and endless, its soil red with the memory of ancient wars. The sky was darkened by the gathering dust of countless feet, and in the distance he heard the rhythmic thunder of an army marching as one, a sea of discipline and might, 30,000 Spartans advancing in perfect formation, their bronze shields gleaming like fire against the dim horizon, their spears raised like a forest of steel. The Viking drew a deep breath, his lungs filling with the cold air of destiny, and in that breath he felt the memory of his ancestors, their voices carried by the wind, urging him to stand though he was but one against a multitude. He remembered the fjords and the halls of his people. He remembered the long ships cresting through waves. He remembered feasts lit by torchlight where tales of impossible battles were told. And now he knew that he had become one of those tales, a man facing the impossible with nothing but his courage and the gods who watched unseen. The ground trembled as the Spartans approached, their war chants rising like thunder, their unified cry shattering the stillness of the plain. The Viking planted his feet into the soil, gripping his axe, his heart steady, though the horizon was consumed by warriors who outnumbered him beyond imagination. He was not blind to the futility of it, yet he felt no fear, for fear belonged to men who doubted their purpose, and his purpose was clear. The first line of Spartans broke away, their shields raised, their spears thrust forward, and the Viking roared, a sound like a storm breaking upon cliffs, and he charged to meet them. His axe descended with brutal precision, cleaving through bronze and bone, his raw power scattering the disciplined lines of warriors who had trained since childhood. They fell before him like waves against stone. Yet for each Spartan struck down, 10 more filled the gap, their discipline unbroken, their resolve unshaken. Still he fought, his strength drawn not only from muscle, but from the spirit of his people, each swing of his axe echoing with the fury of northern seas. Hours seemed to pass within moments, time twisting in the haze of battle, the plain a blur of shields, spears, and crimson sprays of blood. The Viking moved like a force of nature, his strikes heavy, his movements relentless, his body scarred but unyielding. The Spartans pressed him from all sides, their numbers endless, yet he found in himself a rhythm of survival, a balance of rage and control, fury tempered by the instinct of a warrior who had lived his life by the edge of a blade. Still the weight of 30,000 bore down upon him, their shields clashing, their chants never faltering, and he realized that this was not merely a battle of flesh, but of spirit, his solitary defiance against the unbreakable wall of unity. The sky darkened further, thunder rolling across the heavens, and the Viking felt the storm within him rise to meet it. He howled to the gods, asking not for rescue but for the strength to endure. And with each cry his axe cut deeper, his body moving faster, his will burning brighter. The Spartans faltered for a moment, shaken not by numbers, but by the sight of a single man refusing to yield. And in that hesitation the Viking carved a path through their ranks, his roars echoing across the field like drums of doom. Yet for all his might, the tide was endless, and still they came, an ocean of bronze and steel stretching beyond sight. And so the first part of his ordeal unfolded, one man against an army, a storm against the sea, his soul unbroken as the plain of destiny drank the blood of both Spartan and Viking alike. The Viking's breath came in ragged bursts, his chest rising and falling as sweat and blood mixed upon his skin, his axe sticky with the remains of countless foes, his muscles screaming with the effort of each swing. Hours or perhaps lifetimes seemed to have passed upon that plain. Yet still the Spartans came, their discipline as endless as the sea, their movements as precise as a tide that never faltered. For every man that fell, another stepped forward, and though the Viking's strength was monumental, even storms must tire when they strike against cliffs without end. He adjusted his stance, his boots sinking into soil turned to mud from the blood of thousands, and in his eyes burned not despair, but the sharp gleam of cunning, the mind of a warrior who knew that survival demanded more than brute force. He began to notice the rhythm of the Spartan ranks, the way their spears thrust in perfect harmony, the way their shields locked together in walls of bronze, the way their chants rose and fell as if guided by one heartbeat. They fought not as 30,000 men, but as a single organism, vast and unyielding. To break them, he could not strike only with muscle, he would have to use wit, to become the wolf among their herd, unpredictable and merciless. So he shifted his approach, feigning weakness at times, stumbling back as though his body had begun to fail, luring them into overextending their lines. When a cluster of Spartans pressed too eagerly, he would whirl suddenly, his axe carving arcs that shattered shields and tore through armor. His feigned exhaustion transformed into a predator's strike. Each time he cut them down, the surrounding soldiers tightened their formation, wary now. But he had already learned the truth. Even perfect unity could be fractured by patience and deception. The Viking began to move with the ebb and flow of the Spartan tide, withdrawing to the edges of the plain where the terrain shifted, where rocks and uneven ground broke the clean lines of their advance. He forced them to fight in spaces where their shields could not lock so tightly, where their spears were less effective, and in those fractured places his axe became a storm once more, reducing disciplined soldiers to scattered men who bled like any others. Yet the effort was immense, and every trick, every maneuver drained him further. His shoulders felt like lead, his lungs burned, and blood seeped from wounds he could no longer count. Still he pressed on, his mind clear even as his body begged for rest, and in his heart he spoke silently to the gods of the north. Grant me no mercy, only the strength to make this fight worthy of song. Night fell upon the battlefield, the stars glimmering faintly above the haze of smoke and dust. Fires burned where torches had been dropped, casting the plain in a flickering glow, and the Viking found himself surrounded by corpses in every direction. Yet the army still remained, their numbers diminished, but vast beyond reckoning. And he knew that this was no battle to be won by slaughter alone. So he sought instead to break their spirit, to show them that even 30,000 hearts could know fear. He climbed upon a mound of bodies, his figure looming in the firelight, his roar echoing across the night. The Spartans paused, their chants faltering for the first time, their formation wavering as they beheld the silhouette of the man who had slain thousands without yielding. The Viking raised his axe high, blood dripping from its edge, his voice carrying across the plain like thunder. I am one, and I remain. How many more will you feed to me before your courage breaks? His challenge cut through the night, and though their discipline was great, even Spartans were men, and doubt began to creep into their eyes. For the first time, hesitation lingered in their ranks. Uncertainty gnawed at their perfect rhythm, and the Viking saw the smallest cracks appear in their unity. He pressed forward once more, no longer seeking only to kill, but to unnerve, striking swiftly, then vanishing into the haze, using the shadows and firelight as cover. He became a phantom of death among them, and whispers spread like wildfire. He could not be human. He was a demon sent by gods of the north. Yet even as fear grew, so did his exhaustion, his body nearing its limits, every movement a war against his own failing strength. The Viking knew he could not endure forever, but endurance was not his goal. His goal was to etch his defiance into their souls, to prove that one man's spirit could rattle the courage of an army. As dawn's first light touched the battlefield, the Vikings stood battered and bleeding, but unbroken. The Spartans prepared once more, rallying their discipline, their commanders driving them to tighten ranks and renew the assault. The Viking smiled grimly, knowing that the trial was far from over, and though his arms trembled and his body cried for rest, his spirit flared once more. He would fight until the plain itself remembered him, until the earth bore the mark of his defiance, until every Spartan who survived carried the memory of the lone Viking who stood against 30,000. The battlefield had long since ceased to resemble earth. It was no longer soil beneath the Vikings' feet, but a shifting ground of broken shields, shattered spears, and bodies of warriors who had once marched with perfect discipline. The air was heavy with smoke, iron, and the metallic sting of blood, the cries of the dying echoing like ghosts across the plain. The Viking stood at the center of it all, his chest heaving, his axe dragging against the ground, his body torn and battered, yet still upright, still burning with the defiance that no blade could extinguish. The Spartans had fought without falter, yet the sight of this one man enduring against 30,000 gnawed at them. Their unity was strained, their rhythm disrupted by disbelief, their chants losing strength each time they saw him rise anew from what should have been his grave. He had become more than flesh to them. He was a storm made flesh, a nightmare that refused to yield. Yet even storms must meet their limits, and within the Viking's heart he felt the creeping cold of exhaustion seep into his bones. His vision blurred, and every breath tasted of fire, yet his spirit refused surrender. He recalled the sagas of his ancestors, of men who defied gods, of heroes who walked into death singing, and he knew that now he was living one of those sagas. Each strike of his axe was slower than before, but carried the weight of inevitability. Each roar from his throat was cracked with pain, yet still shook the confidence of those who stood before him. The Spartans pressed on, wave after wave, their commanders driving them with shouts, their formations shoring up even as they faltered. For every faltering step they remembered their heritage, their oaths, their kings, and their gods. And so the clash became not only a struggle of blades, but a war of spirits, one man against the will of a people. Lightning tore across the sky, thunder rolling so loud it seemed the heavens themselves had joined the battle. The Viking raised his head, eyes catching the storm above, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw the faces of his ancestors in the clouds, watching, judging, urging him onward. He bellowed into the storm, and his axe rose once more, cleaving through armor, splitting shields, sending blood across the trampled ground. The Spartans answered with their chant, voices like a wall of iron, and they surged as one, encircling him, spears pressing from every side. He twisted, ducked, struck, his body a blur of desperation and willpower. Yet for every foe he felled, a dozen more closed in. Still he roared, still he struck, until his arms quaked from the weight of his own weapon, until his knees threatened to buckle beneath him. In that moment of weakness, the Spartans pressed harder, their discipline regaining its edge, their wall of bronze tightening. The Viking stumbled, his axe lowered, his body pierced by spears grazing his sides, his blood soaking into the earth. Yet his eyes did not dim. Instead they blazed with something beyond mortal strength, a fire born of defiance, of pride, of the refusal to be forgotten. With a final cry that split the night, he swung his axe in an arc so mighty it shattered the spears around him, cleaving a path through the wall of shields. The Spartans reeled back, shocked not by the destruction, but by the sheer force of his spirit. He stood tall, surrounded by carnage, and for an instant it seemed the tide itself had broken. Yet destiny does not bow to defiance forever. His strength waned, his body collapsing even as his will burned. The Spartans closed in once more, their numbers inexhaustible, their determination renewed. They saw now not only a foe, but a symbol that had to be extinguished. The plain shook with their march, the chant of 30,000 voices rising again to drown the roar of one. The Viking looked upon them, a weary smile upon his bloodied face, and whispered to the storm, "If I fall, let it be known I did not bend." The lightning flashed, illuminating him like a figure carved from legend. And in that brilliance, the battle reached its peak. Man against army, storm against sea, will against inevitability. And though his body faltered, his spirit towered, unyielding even as the tide prepared to crash down upon him for the final time. The storm did not relent. Winds howled across the blood-soaked plain, scattering ash and broken banners, carrying with them the scent of fire and steel. The Viking stood amidst the tempest, like the last tree in a burning forest, unbowed, unbroken, though his body screamed for release. His arms trembled with the weight of his axe, his legs ached with every step, his lungs pulled in ragged breaths that tasted of iron. But still he refused to fall. All around him the Spartans moved as one, 30,000 voices united in a chant that reverberated through the battlefield, their shields clashing in rhythm, their discipline perfect despite the exhaustion and terror gnawing at their hearts. For they had never faced such defiance, never witnessed a single soul carve his name into the earth with such fury. The commanders shouted for the phalanx to close, to strike in unison, and so they did, spears thrusting like a tide of steel. The Viking twisted, parried, swung, his axe a whirlwind that shattered wood and split iron, but the wounds upon his flesh deepened. His blood stained the snow and mud beneath his feet, and each drop seemed to burn brighter in the eyes of his foes. A reminder that he still lived, still fought, still defied them. He was no longer merely a man to them. He had become a force, a story, a nightmare that they would tell for generations. The clash grew deafening, the roars of warriors mingling with the thunder above, until the battlefield itself seemed alive with fury. The Vikings' vision blurred, the world reduced to flashes of bronze, sparks from clashing steel, and the endless chant of his enemies. Yet deep within, past the exhaustion, past the pain, he found a quiet place, a memory of home. The fjords bathed in dawn light, the laughter of his kin around a fire, the songs of his people rising beneath a sky filled with stars. He clung to that vision. Let it fill him. Let it carry him beyond the battlefield. For he knew the end was near, but he would not meet it as prey. He would meet it as a warrior. With one last surge he raised his axe, his roar breaking through the chant. A sound so fierce it startled even the disciplined ranks before him. He charged, his massive form colliding with shields, his blade tearing through armor, his fury scattering men who had thought themselves unshakable. The ground shook beneath his assault, and for a brief moment it seemed that even 30,000 could not contain him. But fate is a tide no man can forever resist. The Spartans regrouped, the circle closed, and from every direction spears struck. They pierced his shoulders, his sides, his legs, driving deeper with every heartbeat. Yet even as his body faltered, he did not scream. His eyes blazed with fire, his mouth curled into a grim smile, and his hands still clutched the axe that had felled so many. With the last of his strength, he swung once more, the blade tearing through the air in a wide arc that sent a final wave of Spartans sprawling. Then his knees buckled. The world tilted. He sank to the ground, his breath shallow, his blood pooling around him. The storm above calmed, the thunder fading into a distant rumble, as though the heavens themselves bowed in silence. The Spartans lowered their spears, stepping back in awe, for they saw in his fall not victory, but the end of something greater, something they could scarcely name. Their chant died, replaced by silence, broken only by the wind. The Viking lay still, his eyes turned toward the sky, where the clouds parted to reveal a stretch of stars. He exhaled, slow and steady, as though his spirit had already begun its journey beyond the mortal realm. In that moment he was no longer their enemy, no longer a beast defying their ranks. He was legend, carved into the memory of every man who had witnessed him stand alone against 30,000. And as his final breath slipped into the night, the storm lifted entirely, leaving the battlefield bathed in moonlight. The Spartans stood in silence, their shields lowered, their spears forgotten, as though instinct told them to honor the fallen warrior. No cheers rose, no songs of triumph echoed. Instead, they watched the still form of the man who had defied them, and each of them knew they would never see his like again. Somewhere beyond the stars, his ancestors would welcome him, a warrior who had walked into death unbent, unbroken, his spirit eternal. And on the earth he left behind, his story would live forever, whispered in awe by those who had fought him and passed on in wonder by those who heard the tale. The Viking had fallen, but his echo would thunder through eternity.